Vamos a iniciar nuestro evento principal de este día. Primero agradeciendo la presencia del profesor Martin Borowski y segundo agradeciendo mucho la atención que tiene cada uno de ustedes al estar esta mañana con todas y con todos nosotros. Good morning. I'm great for you from Mexico City. Good afternoon, Heidelberg. First, I want to thank you for joining us for a chat in this morning. I also want to tell you that it's a privilege to share an event with you, and I think that you are a great philosopher of the love today. I will explain the dynamics of the event. We will first listen to your lecture for 30 or 35 minutes. Then each commenter will have up to 10 minutes to post their comments, and at the end, we will have a round of questions asked by the commenters and by the audience that is being with us. I'm going to read your curriculum summary. I will speak in Spanish. El profesor Martin Borowski inició su carrera de abogado en la Universidad Christian Albert en Kiel el 5 de octubre de 1985. Es doctor en Derecho por la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad Christian Albert en Kiel desde 1997 con el tema de tesis doctoral Los derechos fundamentales como principios bajo la supervisión de Robert Alexi, la cual recibió un premio por parte de la Facultad de Derecho. Sería ocioso leer más sobre la reseña curricular del profesor. Estamos ante la presencia de uno de los grandes filósofos contemporáneos en Alemania y uno de los grandes filósofos de los derechos fundamentales. Profesor, ¿tiene usted la palabra?
Yep. Thank you for organizing this splendid event here today, and I'm grateful that I can be with you. There have been and will ever be a great many controversies on fundamental human rights. Most of these controversies are substantive in nature. To what extent justifies common welfare to interfere with individual liberty and the individual's right to equal treatment? How to balance individual autonomy, protected by means of constitutional rights, and international legal rights with collective autonomy reflected in democratic processes? How much redistribution of wealth by means of social rights is required by the Constitution? And where is the point at which the tax burden for those who are talented and hardworking becomes illegitimate? To mention only a couple of more concrete issues, where is the balance between the right to life of an unborn child and a mother-to-be's autonomy to decide as to whether she actually becomes a mother or not? To what extent do dignity, honor, and privacy limit free speech and vice versa? Where is the point at which the liberty to pursue one's business as one wishes is violated by interference for the sake of environmental protection and the fight against climate change? To what extent is the state not only empowered, but under an obligation to pursue environmental protection and the prevention of climate change, even at the cost of the citizens' liberties? There are lively debates on these and other issues. Often there are entrenched positions, so that after a protracted and repeated exchange of arguments, some fundamental disagreements remain. What can we do to overcome such fundamental disagreements? We could resort to moral philosophy or political philosophy for answers. Political philosophers may agree among themselves that some answers are more plausible than others, but generally, they are very much at odds with each other. Their approaches and models propose reconstructions of the tensions, for example, between and among individual rights and collective goods with greater clarity. But the gain in clarity highlights the fundamental disagreements rather than mitigating or deciding them. Compare John Rawls' theory of justice, which permits and requires the redistribution of wealth, with Robert Nozick's libertarian plea for a minimalist state, which limits the state to the mere protection against force, theft, the enforcement of contracts, and the like. Political philosophy is certainly helpful. It cannot, however, replace constitutional theory and doctrine. A pessimistic answer would be to simply hand over unrestrained political power to a person or organ. Unrestrained political power is, however, a dictatorship. The argument could go on that this person or organ is democratically legitimized. Proper democratic legitimacy depends, however, on a number of complex but important conditions, and even democratic legitimacy does not solve the problem of the dictatorship of the majority. Constitutional rights are protections of minorities against the majority. Constitutional rights limit the results of the democratic process. Even though a certain parliamentary statute may be arrived at by a democratically legitimated parliament, in the proper constitutional process, it proves unconstitutional and null and void if it violates, from the substantive point of view, constitutional rights. I hasten to add that in assessing claims stemming from constitutional rights, there is some discretion for democratically legitimated organs of state, first and foremost the parliament. The discretion is, that is my point here, limited. Thus, we are in a difficult situation. Hard cases in constitutional law raise the issue of fundamental disagreements on general principles of justice and the uncertainty and how to concretize these contested principles in individual cases. We need something that is more grounded in facticity than sheer moral correctness, and at the same time more ideal than sheer facticity. We need a discipline that mediates between ideal normativity and facticity. That discipline is the law. It is characteristic of the law that it provides structures and processes with which the claim to moral correctness can be legitimately raised, ideal dimension, and organs and processes are endowed with the authority to enforce decisions, real dimension. This characteristic of the law can also be seen in constitutional rights. Both their existence in the form of constitutional provisions and their interpretation by organs of the state is morally undergirded by human rights as moral rights. For human rights as moral rights per se lack any institutionalization and thereby effective enforceability, they morally require that they be transformed into law. This is the first argument for the transformation of human rights as moral rights into the law, the argument from effective enforcement. The second argument is the argument from authoritative cognition. According to this argument, the cognition of human rights as moral rights is uncertain and contested, so that there needs to be an authoritative judgment which rights to record in the Constitution and how to concretize them in their application. The first task is for the Constituent Assembly, the framers of the Constitution. The second for the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, eventually for the Constitutional Court. Basic rights I shall use this expression as the general term for both constitutional rights as national basic rights and international legal instruments for the protection of human rights, are what they are because their characteristic is to mediate between ideal normativity and mere facticity. When I began my research on the structure of constitutional rights, more than 2.5 decades ago, actually, in my PhD, I placed 3 distinctions center stage. First, whether rights are granted by binding legal norms. Second, whether a legal position is a subjective right or merely an expression of an objective norm. And third, whether a constitutional right provides for a definitive position or a prima facie position. There are, of course, many other important distinctions in the debate on basic rights, but these 3 key distinctions still strike me as particularly fundamental. Initially, I focused on constitutional rights in national states. The picture becomes a bit more complicated when one takes instruments for the legal protection of human rights in international law into consideration, basic rights in international law. I would argue, however, that this confirms rather than proves false my assumption on the 3 key characteristics of basic rights. Such instruments for the legal protection of human rights in international law are, just as constitutional rights, instruments for the legal protection of human rights, namely basic rights, only that they are part of international law rather than national law. The same rules apply, mutatis mutandis, to international instruments. Legal documents, such as constitutions or parliamentary statutes, usually provide for norms that are legally binding, namely, norms the violation of which can be established by a court. The finding of a violation of such norm by a court, be it a centralized constitutional court or any court in the legal system in a decentralized system of constitutional review, will usually imply enforcement measures. For example, that a parliamentary statute that violates a constitutional right has to be regarded null and void by all organs of state. The German Basic Law provides for, in Article 1, paragraph 3, I quote, "The following basic rights shall bind the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary as directly applicable law." Close quote. This makes clear that all provisions in the current German constitution that record basic rights are norms that are legally binding. To be sure, things have been less clear in German constitutional history. Under the Weimar Constitution, in force from 1919 up to the National Socialist regime in the mid-1930s, there was a lively debate as to which kinds of constitutional rights were actually binding law and which were not. For the latter, the term Programmsätze, merely programmatic norms would be the English direct translation, or singular, Programmsatz, became famous, or one should better say notorious. Even though this is now ruled out by Article 1, paragraph 3, Basic Law, just quoted, for constitutional rights, there are other norms of the Constitution that are, according at least to some of my colleagues, not binding law. The temptation to declare legal norms you do not like, for which reason ever, to be not binding seems difficult to resist. Another example, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789 was considered to be part of French constitutions for centuries. But this did not have immediate legal consequences until the second half of the 20th century. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 10th December 1948 was a resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which does not carry binding force per se. Thus, for legal instruments for the protection of human rights in international law, one needs to distinguish whether such instruments are binding international and/or binding national law. The second, binding national law, does not follow automatically from the first. This depends on whether and how international law becomes part of the municipal legal system. Even if there is a non-binding international instrument, a national state can lend legally binding force to the international instrument by domestic legislation. I tend to think that, at the end of the day, it is the enforcement before national courts that is crucial for effective enforcement. The argument from effective enforcement calls for the binding nature, first and foremost, in the national legal system. The expression subjective right is often used without a clear definition. I shall understand this expression as referring to a complex legal position. For example, there may be a substantive legal position according to which there is a definitive prohibition for the state to interfere with attending a certain church service. The individual A wants to attend this church service, and we know that the state violates A's religious freedom if A is barred from attending the church service. This usually needs to be established by balancing religious freedom with the relevant limiting reasons. But let us assume, for the sake of keeping my example as simple as possible, that religious freedom outweighs the limiting reason. This substantive legal position, according to which A may not be barred from attending the church service, is provided for by an objective norm. Any organ of state definitely acts unconstitutionally if it bars A from attending the church service. This objective norm becomes a subjective right if and when A has the legal power, the competence you could also say, the legal power to enforce the substantive legal position before a court, be it any ordinary court or a constitutional court. This legal competence, the legal power, is a procedural legal position that refers to the substantive legal position. A is procedurally empowered to enforce his religious freedom, the substantive legal position, before the courts. Thus, the transformation of an objective legal norm to a subjective right is marked by adding the procedural legal position that a person is empowered to enforce a substantive legal position before a court. The fact that a substantive legal position protects the interests of an individual is a strong argument that this individual also has the legal competence to enforce this substantive position before a court. A has a strong interest that his religious freedom is respected by the state. This suggests that it is also him who decides whether or not to bring legal action. What would happen if the holder of the substantive legal position were not empowered to enforce this substantive legal position before the courts? It would be left to organs of the state to decide whether A's religious freedom ought to be enforced. The organs of state do not, however, have an intrinsic interest in enforcing constitutional rights. It is the core idea of human rights to protect fundamental interests of the individual. Thus, it ought to be decided by the autonomous individual, him or herself, whether a violation of his or her basic rights is brought before the courts. The distinction between substantive legal positions and the legal power to enforce these substantive legal positions before the courts is crucial for a proper understanding of debates on subjective rights. If one wants to deny that an individual has a subjective right, one can distinguish between arguments against the substantive legal position and arguments against the legal power to enforce this substantive legal position before the courts. Let us suppose that there is a debate on measures against the COVID-19 pandemic, and a prohibition of church services is justified by reference to public health. The executive argues that A has no subjective right to attend church services during the pandemic. What does that mean? Considering the distinction between substantive legal positions and the legal power to enforce these substantive legal positions before the courts, it may mean two different things. First, there is no substantive legal position according to which A is definitely permitted to attend church services, or second, there is such substantive legal position, but A is not empowered to enforce this substantive legal position before the courts. It is pretty obvious that the first meaning is the correct interpretation of the statement. Of course, it is possible to discuss specifically whether or not an individual has the legal power to enforce certain substantive legal positions before the courts. But specific arguments against this procedural power are rare. This is usually not meant with a statement that an individual has, quotation, no subjective right to X. It is usually meant that there is no substantive legal position that this individual is entitled to X. The substantive legal positions implied by basic rights, constitutional rights, are typically substantive prima facie positions. For example, religious freedom, as mentioned above, is a prima facie liberty. Such a prima facie liberty can be limited if the formal and substantive criteria for limitation are met. Once limitation has taken place, definitive religious liberty has been established. This is what is left. It has been argued that the interpretation of basic rights as prima facie rights renders these rights too weak, deprives them of the special status they deserve. To be sure, a definitive or absolute right from the outset is stronger than a prima facie right. There is, however, a serious problem if two definitive or absolute rights compete with each other, since by definition, both absolute rights must fully take precedence over the other respectively, which is impossible. To avoid this problem, a system of absolute rights must make sure that such competition does not occur, which, in turn, makes a very narrow interpretation of absolute rights necessary. At the end of the day, in such a static system, there is relatively little protection of constitutional rights or other basic rights. By contrast, if one accepts that competitions between and among individual rights and collective goods occur, a prima facie right can be conceptualized far more generously than an absolute right. The rigidity of supposed absolute rights can be reconstructed by means of very high relative weight attributed to them in the balancing, so that a system of prima facie rights may well contain rights that are more or less weighty from the abstract point of view. Since balancing judgments are taken under certain circumstances, and these circumstances change over time, balancing judgments typically may change accordingly. For example, many would agree that limiting church services for the sake of public health must be possible during a pandemic. Either first, before the pandemic, or second, after the pandemic has sufficiently receded, religious liberty implies the definitive constitutional right to attend church services. Only the dynamic reading of constitutional rights as prima facie positions explains why there is normally a definitive right to attend church services, while during a pandemic with a certain virus, there is actually no such definitive right. By contrast, a system of only definitive rights could only assume that either there is such definitive right, which would be severely detrimental during a pandemic, for obvious reasons, or that there is no such definitive right, but this deprived the citizens of this aspect of religious liberty before and after a pandemic without any convincing reason. The nature of constitutional rights as prima facie rights, or in other words, as limitable rights, is the basis for the whole doctrine of constitutional rights and international basic rights developed in Germany and abroad over the last 7 decades. To determine what is prima facie protected, the area of protection, Schutzbereich, is distinguished from the interference, Eingriff. The personal dimension of the area of protection, personeller Schutzbereich, determines who is protected, who are the holders of this right, individuals, citizens or every human being, private associations and corporations, even organs and bodies of the state, if only by exception. The material dimension of the area of protection, sachlicher Schutzbereich, determines what is protected, an action of the holder of the right or a state, referring to the person. Finally, the interference, Eingriff, characterizes against which behavior of the state there is prima facie protection. Only intentional and direct effects of the behavior of organs or bodies of the state, or also unintentional, merely factual, and also indirect effects, to mention only some of the possible distinctions. Once the prima facie right has finally been determined, the issue of justification is at stake. To begin with, is the constitutional right in question limitable in the first place? Is there a written limitation clause, or is the legal power of the state to limit the right implicitly granted? Basic rights often require that a limitation is, quote, provided for by law, close quote, which is to say that, in the German reading of this requirement, the executive and the judiciary require prior authorization by parliamentary statute, for only parliament is directly democratically legitimated. Formal criteria for limitation include, for example, the legislative competence. A federal law is unconstitutional if the Constitution attributes, in a federal state, the legislative competence to the states and proper legislative procedure. The main substantive criterion for the limitation of constitutional rights is the principle of proportionality with its three prongs: suitability to further a legitimate end, necessity, and proportionality in its narrower sense, the balancing test. It is characteristic of the prima facie right that its application permits and indeed requires balancing. The German debate on constitutional rights has been centered for decades around the main distinction: area of protection, personal and material dimension, interference, justification of interference by reference to formal and substantive criteria. It actually proves very useful to have such a general doctrine, for the similarities and differences between different constitutional rights become clear. This avoids that the whole system of constitutional rights and their interpretation becomes inconsistent and incoherent. This is a great danger if one simply follows the contingency of an organic growth of case law, with little reflection on the key distinctions in the doctrine of constitutional rights. Now that the three distinctions, first, rights that are granted by norms that are legally binding or not; second, subjective right or merely objective norm; or third, prima facie right and definitive right, have been sketched, it has hopefully become clear what is usually meant with the statement A has a subjective right to attend church service. It means that A has a subjective and definitive right that is granted by a norm that is legally binding. In turn, the statement A has no such subjective right precisely means that A does not have a subjective and definitive right that is granted by a norm that is legally binding. Nota bene, this does not necessarily mean that A's right is not a subjective right. It typically means something different, namely that A's right is not a definitive right, because A's substantive legal position, his liberty, is limited. So that this legal position that A has become a definitive non-right, or, to use other words with the same meaning, a mere prima facie right. This shows that our typical language in constitutional law is not very precise. We seem to refer to a lack of a procedural power, while actually we want to express the lack of a substantive legal position. This is just one instance in which a more thorough analysis proves helpful in understanding on which we agree or disagree in our debates. Such analytical clarity is of utmost importance if we want to convincingly justify the interpretation of constitutional rights in hard cases. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your conference. It will undoubtedly be very useful for understanding fundamental rights in Mexico. Let's start the comment section. Panelists can ask their questions. I will speak in Spanish. Vamos a iniciar la ronda de las preguntas y de los comentarios que van a formular los panelistas. Bueno, primero agradeciendo mucho la conferencia del profesor Borowski y decirles a las personas que están siguiendo el evento que gran parte de la charla se puede robustecer con este libro que se denomina La estructura de los derechos fundamentales, que fue publicado por la Universidad del Externado de Colombia y que es en parte el libro que comenzó a narrar el profesor al inicio de su conferencia. Y bueno, vamos a iniciar entonces con la ronda de los comentarios y las preguntas de los panelistas. Para esto vamos a tener la siguiente dinámica. Cada uno de los participantes va a tener hasta 10 minutos para hacer su intervención y, de ser posible, que al final de la misma puedan formularle las preguntas al profesor para que al finalizar la participación de las 4 personas le demos la oportunidad al profesor de responderlas. En esa tesitura vamos a iniciar con nuestra ronda, cediéndole la palabra a la doctora Paula Gorzoni, de la cual me voy a permitir leer una muy breve reseña curricular. La doctora Paula es doctora por la Universidad de Kiel en Alemania, cuenta con maestría y bachillerato en Derecho por la Universidad de Sao Paulo, Brasil, es abogada en Sao Paulo, Brasil, y le pido entonces a la doctora Paula si puede habilitar su cámara, si puede habilitar su micrófono para comenzar su participación hasta por 10 minutos.
Buenos días a todos, muchas gracias por la invitación de hablar aquí. Gracias al profesor Borowski por la ponencia muy interesante. Y también quiero decir gracias a todos los participantes, doctor Francisco, Giovanni, Edgar y principalmente Arnulfo por la invitación. Bueno, en mi intervención voy a intentar hablar muy brevemente. Voy a hablar de las 3 principales divisiones que el profesor Borowski presentó de una perspectiva del derecho comparado. Bueno, en primer lugar, que se habló de normas vinculantes o no vinculantes. El principal concepto es que normas vinculantes significan, entre otras cosas, normas cuya lesión puede ser establecida por un tribunal. Es así, es no solamente en el ordenamiento jurídico alemán, pero también en el ordenamiento jurídico brasileño y también el mexicano. Pero en los ordenamientos jurídicos latinoamericanos tenemos una gran diferencia en nuestras constituciones que fueron establecidas la gran mayoría a partir de los años 80. La de Brasil fue en 1988, porque tenemos positivados en nuestras constituciones también derechos sociales y económicos, los llamados DESC. Y la dificultad de los DESC sería cómo tornar efectivos este rol que, por ejemplo, derecho a la salud, derecho a la educación, también relacionada a derechos colectivos como derecho al medio ambiente. Entonces, cuando pensamos también cómo tornar efectivos estos derechos frente al tribunal, estamos hablando de ámbito de protección que puede ser un ámbito de protección colectivo y contra quién, que puede ser también colectivo o individual. Voy a dar 2 ejemplos para hacer tornar más sencillo esto, para mostrar cómo la concepción de la estructura puede ser más sensible en este ámbito de los derechos sociales. Por ejemplo, se puede haber una prohibición de la venta de productos de tabaco sin una especificación de que los productos de tabaco pueden producir peligro a la salud. Esto estaría limitando, por ejemplo, la libertad comercial de los productores de tabaco, pero estaría en pro de una salud colectiva. Por otro lado, puedes pensar también que un niño vive en una ciudad donde no hay escuela suficiente y no hay plaza. Entonces, podría estar al frente del tribunal y pedir una plaza. Esto sería una dimensión individual de un derecho social. Pero por otro lado, podría ser también pensar en una situación de un derecho a salud, si hay un sistema público de salud del Estado que no fornece un específico tipo de tratamiento o de medicamento. Entonces, en ese caso sería un derecho individual de efectivación que la persona podría pleitear frente al tribunal. Pero por otro lado estaría una dimensión colectiva de las finanzas del Estado. Entonces es interesante ver que hay dos dimensiones de colectivo e individual en la forma de vincular y también la posibilidad de efectivar los derechos sociales y económicos frente a un tribunal. En ese sentido, yo también gustaría de formular mi primera pregunta, que ahí se ve también una dimensión entre la efectivación de los derechos fundamentales en general, pero también cuestiones democráticas, porque muchas veces una política pública de salud, por ejemplo, o de otros derechos sociales, es formulada para maximizar el bien de todos, de la colectividad. Una causa, si una persona logra una efectivación que es muy costosa, esto podría perjudicar una política pública visando el social versus el individual. Entonces, me gustaría que el profesor hablase un poco más exactamente sobre si por un lado derechos fundamentales son para la protección de la minoría, pero al mismo tiempo implica una limitación del proceso democrático. Entonces, gustaría de escuchar un poco más en relación a este conflicto entre derechos constitucionales y democracia. Bueno, la segunda parte que me gustaría de hablar es relacionada a las posiciones prima facie y las posiciones definitivas. En relación a esto, me parece muy interesante pensar en la dignidad humana. Bueno, tanto en la Constitución alemana como la Constitución brasileña hay ahí entre el rol de derechos fundamentales la protección a la dignidad humana. Creo que en la mexicana debe tener un artículo muy semejante. Pero es muy difícil pensar que algún tribunal o una Corte Suprema se va a limitar la dignidad humana en colisión con un otro derecho fundamental. Entonces me parece más complicado, más difícil de pensar la dignidad humana como un principio con estructura de mandamiento de optimización, parece más como una posición definitiva. En ese sentido, entonces, me gustaría de preguntar cómo debería ser definida en verdad la dignidad humana. Si hay casos o ejemplos de juzgamientos donde la dignidad humana se fue balanceada o restringida o una limitación. ¿Cómo eso está en las cortes? Bueno, por la parte de la jurisprudencia brasileña, que parece es que generalmente la dignidad humana no es en verdad balanceada, pero es como que se está en un lado de la ponderación, está como dando más peso para un derecho. Entonces, como un argumento que da más peso a un lado, pero difícilmente el derecho que está asociado a la dignidad humana como argumento será limitado. Bueno, estas son mis dos preguntas, mis comentarios. Muchas gracias nuevamente.
Muchas gracias, doctora Paula, por su intervención. A continuación, para seguir con la dinámica, le vamos a dar la palabra al doctor Giovanni Asael Figueroa Mejía. Primero señalar que el doctor Figueroa es una de las personas que coordina este grupo de Hablemos de Derecho Procesal Constitucional, y en lo personal me da mucho gusto presentarlo esta mañana. Y bueno, aunque ya muchas personas lo conocen, diré que el doctor Giovanni es doctor en Derecho Constitucional, Convención Europea, por la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Es académico de tiempo completo y coordinador de la maestría en Derechos Humanos de la Universidad Iberoamericana, Ciudad de México. Y finalmente diré que el doctor Giovanni es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores de CONACYT nivel 1. Y bueno, sin más preámbulo, le voy a dar el uso de la palabra al doctor Giovanni para que durante 10 minutos haga sus comentarios y le formule las preguntas al profesor.
Pues buenos días. Agradezco en primer lugar a los profesores Edgar Caballero y Arnulfo Mateos por la invitación a participar en este foro. Thank you very much, Profesor Borowski, for your presentation. Como hemos podido constatar, el profesor Borowski en su charla introduce algunos problemas del lenguaje que considero deben tenerse en cuenta por los constitucionalistas, ya que su desconocimiento provoca opacidad y ambigüedad en la aplicación del ordenamiento jurídico. Por ello, como hemos podido ver, considera imprescindible, al abordar cada tema, realizar un acercamiento analítico que presupone la determinación del problema a que alude cada apartado que desarrolla. Así, se enfoca en determinar qué son los derechos fundamentales y a partir de ahí desarrolla las 3 distinciones claves que son imprescindibles en la dogmática para su estudio. Al leer y escuchar al profesor, me han llamado la atención varios de sus planteamientos, pero por motivos de tiempo solo me centraré en hacer algunos breves comentarios motivados por lo que nos ha compartido. El profesor, si recordamos, ha hablado del reconocimiento autoritativo de los derechos humanos en la Constitución y distingue que esto lo puede realizar el poder constituyente o el poder reformador de la Constitución según el momento en que esos derechos se incorporan. Y retomando esta idea, me quisiera detener en otra de las vertientes que él también desarrolla y que implica cómo concretiza y aplica esos derechos el poder legislativo. Como sabemos, el legislador goza de legitimidad democrática y al momento de crear la ley tiene cierta discrecionalidad para determinar su contenido. Pero ese legislador, hay que recordar que ya no representa solo a las mayorías, sino que tiene un deber de proteger a las minorías precisamente frente a las mayorías. Y lo suele hacer a través de la incorporación de derechos en el ordenamiento jurídico infraconstitucional, que supone, o que se supone más bien, que ese ordenamiento jurídico, que esa creación del poder legislativo, es acorde con los principios, con los valores y con las reglas constitucionales. Entonces, cabría preguntarse, ¿qué pasa cuando el legislador discrimina en la ley a determinadas personas o grupos? De acuerdo con la teoría de los pesos y contrapesos entre los poderes del Estado, cuando esto sucede, su obra puede ser controlada por los tribunales constitucionales y por las Cortes Supremas. Y estos pueden declarar la inconstitucionalidad de la ley cuando lesione derechos constitucionales, siendo la consecuencia normalmente inmediata la eliminación de esa ley del ordenamiento jurídico. Sin embargo, hay que recordar que desde hace mucho tiempo los tribunales no se limitan a ser legisladores negativos, utilizando la rígida alternativa estimación-desestimación de inconstitucionalidad, sino que a través de diversas modalidades sentenciadoras salvar la constitucionalidad de la ley. En algunas ocasiones, tratando de ser deferentes hacia la obra del legislador, y en otras incluso haciendo decir a la ley, o lo que es peor, a la Constitución, algo que no se desprende de su contenido. Piénsese en el derecho que todos tenemos a la igualdad ante la ley, traducido en algunas constituciones como un principio de igualdad. ¿Qué pasa entonces cuando el legislador, al desarrollar una normativa, vulnera ese principio? Por ejemplo, cuando se establece la figura del matrimonio como la unión entre un solo hombre y una sola mujer que se unen para perpetuar la especie y proporcionarse ayuda mutua. Como podemos ver, este artículo es discriminatorio, no protege el principio de igualdad. Y la respuesta del tribunal debería limitarse a declararlo inconstitucional, eliminarlo del ordenamiento jurídico y en un posible diálogo con el legislador, en el último considerando de la sentencia, si acaso recomendarle que cuando vuelva a configurar esa figura, tenga en cuenta el principio de igualdad. Pero lo que han hecho los tribunales es invadir la obra del legislador democrático. Así, la Suprema Corte Mexicana resolvió que una disposición normativa como esa no tutelaba a la familia como realidad social y en la cual había que incluir a las familias nucleares, monoparentales, homoparentales, por mencionar solamente algunas. Y bajo esa óptica, la sentencia determinó que la manera más eficaz de reparar la discriminación normativa era declarar la inconstitucionalidad de la porción normativa que hace referencia a que el matrimonio solo se puede dar entre un solo hombre y una sola mujer. Y para estar acorde con el mandato constitucional que protege a la familia en sus diferentes formas, sustituye esa porción normativa por la que establece que el matrimonio se puede dar entre dos personas que se unen para proporcionarse ayuda mutua. Desde un punto de vista de derecho comparado, algo similar hizo el Tribunal Supremo Federal de Brasil en su sentencia emitida en 2011 y también la Sala Constitucional de Costa Rica en una de sus últimas sentencias. Esta última sala, incluso después de que le había dado un plazo al legislador para legislar sobre matrimonio igualitario, y como no lo hizo, entró en vigor ese derecho, pues era vinculante por la opinión consultiva de la Corte que fue emitida a solicitud del propio gobierno. Y entonces, a partir de la sentencia, en esos tres sistemas a los cuales he hecho alusión, se permite el matrimonio entre un hombre y una mujer, entre dos hombres o entre dos mujeres. Pero este tipo de respuestas no siempre se dan por todos los tribunales. Basta recordar, por ejemplo, que en un sentido contrario han emitido importantes pronunciamientos, sobre todo los tribunales africanos. Entonces, desde este punto de vista, para ir concluyendo, me gustaría plantearle al profesor, por ejemplo, ¿qué pasa cuando un tribunal constitucional o una Corte Suprema no tiene límites y en su afán de proteger derechos fundamentales incorpora en la ley, por ejemplo, pues disposiciones normativas que de ninguna manera había querido el legislador democrático que formaran parte del ordenamiento jurídico? En ese afán de los tribunales y cortes constitucionales, de en una pretendida deferencia hacia el legislador democrático, salvar la constitucionalidad de su obra. Entonces, aquí me gustaría conocer la opinión del profesor en el sentido de hasta dónde llega, ¿sí?, en esa aplicación de derechos constitucionales y el control que hace un tribunal constitucional sobre la obra del legislador, invadir las competencias que constitucionalmente no le corresponden a un tribunal constitucional. Y también Me gustaría saber, sobre todo tomando en consideración las tres vertientes que nos comenta, si precisamente su posición teórica se podría decir que puede aplicarse de manera universal o si a contrario sensu es una posición relativista. Es decir, si su posición teórica solamente se podría implementar, ¿sí?, en algunos países, en algunas regiones, o si podría ser una corriente de pensamiento que pueda aplicarse a todos los países. Porque creo que cuando uno construye este tipo de posiciones que pareciera que son universales, en algunas ocasiones no toma en consideración la idiosincrasia, cuestiones políticas, cuestiones económicas que no son iguales en las diferentes latitudes. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Giovanni, por su intervención. Y vamos a continuar con el siguiente comentarista. Es el doctor Francisco Mora Cifuentes. En primer lugar, agradecerle la disposición de participar en esta charla con el profesor Borowski. Y bueno, de igual forma, me voy a permitir leer una muy breve síntesis curricular. El profesor Francisco es el titular A por oposición en el Departamento de Derecho de la Universidad de Guanajuato, doctor especializado en Teoría y Filosofía del Derecho por la Universidad Carlos III de Madrid y en Ciencia Política y Derecho Constitucional por el Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales. Es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores Nivel 1 y cuenta con una estancia postdoctoral en el Instituto Europeo Universitario de Florencia, en Italia. Le voy entonces a pedir al profesor Francisco Mora que habilite su cámara, que habilite su micrófono, y le voy a dar entonces el uso de la palabra hasta por 10 minutos.
Perfecto. Bueno, al igual que los demás participantes, quiero externar mi agradecimiento, sobre todo al colega Arnulfo Mateos por la invitación. También me siento muy complacido por estar participando en este seminario o discusión tanto con el doctor Giovanni, con Edgar, por supuesto, y con Paula. Y fundamentalmente estoy muy pues contento y feliz de estar participando o tener la oportunidad nuevamente de compartir espacio con el profesor Martin Borowski. Yo en realidad quería hacer referencia a tres cosas en relación al texto que nos fue participado por el profesor alemán. La primera, que creo que es importante que pudiéramos destacar, es la importancia de su obra, ¿no? Como ya fue dicho tanto por Edgar como por Paula, el profesor Borowski yo creo que es sin duda alguna uno de los teóricos de los derechos fundamentales más importantes con los que contamos en la actualidad, ¿no? Como todos sabemos, su teoría, él ha desarrollado una teoría de los derechos fundamentales como principios, ha dedicado mucho tiempo a intentar articular una teoría que sirva fundamentalmente para una dogmática de los derechos fundamentales, partiendo sobre todo de la ley fundamental de Bonn. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Bueno, para mí es indudable que su obra tiene una dimensión analítica, ¿no? Que podemos advertir claramente en la obra también de su mentor doctoral, del profesor Robert Alexi. Y yo creo que es precisamente ese carácter analítico lo que ha hecho que la teoría de los principios y sobre todo los desarrollos vinculados a la misma, que fundamentalmente, como he dicho, se asocian a la obra del profesor Alexi, hayan podido tener una recepción y sean en la actualidad, pudiéramos decir, parte de las herramientas básicas con lo que no únicamente los teóricos o los filósofos del derecho entienden y comprenden, conceptualizan los derechos, sino sobre todo y fundamentalmente parte de las herramientas fundamentales con las que los operadores jurídicos, y estoy pensando sobre todo en las cortes y en los tribunales constitucionales, utilizan para aplicar y para interpretar esos derechos, ¿no? A final de cuentas, pareciera que el objeto propio de la dogmática consistiría en tener a los derechos fundamentales como derecho positivo, es decir, como derecho incorporado en normas jurídicas, y sobre todo realizar el viejo ideal de hacer compatibles la libertad y la igualdad de todas las personas y de todos los seres humanos, que de alguna manera puede ser reconducida a la idea de dignidad humana y a los derechos fundamentales que podemos derivar de los mismos. La dogmática, a final de cuentas, pretende darnos una sistemática de las relaciones entre los derechos fundamentales considerados como derecho positivo, y básicamente aquí en una doble vertiente, ¿no? En una dimensión subjetiva también, y sobre todo también en una dimensión objetiva, ¿no? Y las preguntas fundamentales pues tendrían que ser cómo se relacionan entre sí esos derechos, cómo podemos limitarlos, o a lo mejor no voy a ser tan técnico, delimitarlos, ¿no? Y sobre todo de manera justificada, cómo puede el legislador, un poco en consonancia con lo que señalaba el profesor Figueroa, intervenir, ¿no? O de alguna manera regular esos derechos y en qué medida, ¿no? Y sobre todo también la idea de cómo pueden los jueces o cómo deben de interpretar los jueces esos derechos fundamentales. Pues bien, yo creo que la obra del profesor Borowski intenta dar una respuesta articulada a todas esas consideraciones, insisto, partiendo de la ley fundamental, pero que sin embargo, por su carácter analítico, como señalé, pueden tener incidencia o pueden ser de utilidad para los operadores jurídicos de otras jurisdicciones, o incluso, como también lo señaló él, para la aplicación del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. Bueno, el texto que el profesor Borowski nos presenta tiene tres partes, como ya ha sido señalado, ¿no? La primera parte, en realidad, habla sobre la tesis de la naturaleza del derecho. Y yo creo que esto es una idea fundante o una idea básica de lo que es la teoría de los derechos fundamentales del profesor Borowski, y obviamente que en alguna medida también retoma o desarrolla la idea de la naturaleza dual del derecho, ¿no? Él hace muy clara esa idea cuando dice que el derecho en realidad lo que hace es mediar entre una normatividad ideal y la mera facticidad. Para decirlo de otra manera, el derecho nos brinda un ámbito de discusión y sobre todo de posibilidad de hacer, de darle vigencia a cierto contenido ideal, darle una vigencia, pudiéramos decir, en el ámbito de la realidad, en el ámbito de la institucionalización, pudiéramos decir, pero sobre todo y también de la posibilidad coactiva de la imposición de esos contenidos asociados a valores fundamentales, como son los derechos fundamentales, ¿no? En el texto se ofrecen tres distinciones claves, como ya se dijo. La primera, tener a los derechos básicos o fundamentales como derecho vinculante, es decir, esto de alguna manera es la afirmación necesaria de la positividad de los derechos entendidos como normas jurídicas directamente aplicables y vinculantes, ¿no? Y no su mera consideración como normas programáticas, como bien señaló el profesor Borowski. La segunda distinción importante tiene que ver con la idea de que los derechos básicos también son derechos subjetivos. Y como derechos subjetivos, y aquí pues, hay varias cuestiones involucradas, la idea fundamental de que en algún determinado momento esa posición jurídica habilita al titular para que éste pueda acudir a los tribunales para hacer valer o hacer válido su derecho, por decirlo de alguna manera. Y finalmente, la tercera distinción que nos ofreció el profesor Borowski tiene que ver con si los derechos nos ofrecen posiciones definitivas o posiciones prima facie. Yo entiendo que en realidad este texto pues tiene, pudiéramos decir, un carácter programático. Es decir, es el pórtico de lo que sería o lo que implicaría su sistema de los derechos fundamentales, ¿no? Estoy pensando sobre todo, por ejemplo, en la idea de las posiciones prima facie, también relacionado con lo que comentó la doctora Paula. ¿Por qué razón? Porque obviamente esto es fundamental para lo que va a ser después la teoría de los límites a los derechos. Es decir, si asumimos una teoría interna de los derechos no limitables o una teoría externa de los derechos, y en última instancia, cómo se termina vinculando esto con la idea de la justificación, ¿no? Del carácter, en última instancia, no positivista de la teoría que se asume en la primera parte. Bueno, dicho esto, la tercera cuestión sería esta. Entiendo que esto es únicamente el pórtico, ¿no? O pudiéramos decir la parte introductoria de lo que sería el sistema de derechos para el profesor Borowski. Entonces, las preguntas que yo tendría serían dos básicamente. La primera tiene que ver con el hecho de si el profesor Borowski adhiere a una específica teoría sobre el fundamento o sobre las razones del derecho, es decir, si él se adhiere a la teoría del interés o de la voluntad o cómo concibe esta situación. Y finalmente, ¿en qué medida el planteamiento o la asunción que hace de entender los derechos como derechos subjetivos puede tener o puede superar una crítica que se le hace, por ejemplo, tradicionalmente a Kelsen, ¿no? De que no distingue entre el derecho y la garantía, ¿no? Dicho de otra manera, si afirmamos que el derecho subjetivo supone la posibilidad de la tutela jurisdiccional de ese ámbito protegido, entonces, si no existe esa posibilidad de accionar o de tutela jurisdiccional, no estaríamos ante un verdadero derecho subjetivo, sería ese el caso y no habría confusión entre el derecho y la garantía. Bueno, estas serían mis preguntas, sobre todo agradecer nuevamente la posibilidad de estar aquí y agradecerle al profesor Borowski la deferencia de participar con él nuevamente en un evento académico. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, profesor Francisco, por la intervención, por sus comentarios, por las preguntas. Y bueno, en lo personal, agradecerle la disposición de trabajar en un proyecto de conjunto que en breve será publicado. Y bueno, vamos a darle el uso de la voz al maestro Arnulfo Daniel Mateos Durán. Bueno, y antes de presentarlo, me gustaría expresar públicamente mi agradecimiento a la generosidad, a todo el trabajo previo que realizó para poder llevar a cabo este evento, expresarle también mi admiración y que bueno, que en mí siempre encontrará a un aliado en este tipo de proyectos académicos. Y bueno, más que proyectos académicos, son proyectos que construimos como amigos. Y bueno, no voy a quitarle más el tiempo. Voy a expresar únicamente que el maestro Arnulfo es licenciado por la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, tiene un máster en la Universidad de Heidelberg, donde actualmente es doctorando. Te doy el uso de la palabra, Arnulfo.
¿Se escucha?
Adelante.
Perfecto. Bueno, muchas gracias, Edgar. Por ahora, simplemente quisiera agradecer sobre todo al profesor Borowski por habernos dado el tiempo de poder participar en esta gran conferencia. Asimismo, quisiera agradecer a Edgar por el espacio y a todos los demás comentaristas, Giovanni, Paula y Francisco. Muchas gracias por participar y también por sus grandes comentarios. Bueno, como Al final me tocó ser el último también. Quiero mantener los tiempos, sobre todo porque aquí se toma muy en serio la cuestión del tiempo. Y simplemente quisiera no tanto criticar o dar un comentario, simplemente hasta cierto punto aclarar algunos conceptos que considero importantes de la presentación del profesor Borowski. Uno de ellos se refiere al carácter vinculatorio de las normas. Este elemento puede parecer muy sencillo porque simplemente es una característica del derecho, pero este elemento puede jugar un papel muy importante si se toma en consideración el derecho internacional. Como mencionó el profesor Borowski, los derechos fundamentales pueden ser de fuente nacional o internacional. Lo único que constituyen es que son el producto de una transformación de un derecho moral que es universalmente aplicable y frente a cualquier particular o estado, y se transforman en derecho positivo. Y al ser derecho positivo adquieren todas las características que tiene el derecho. Digamos, hay una coacción que busca su implementación y también se encuentran dentro de toda la estructura y dinámica del ordenamiento jurídico. En este sentido, no hay que olvidar que los tratados internacionales son muy diversos y son muchos. Claro, nosotros en el contexto latinoamericano conocemos todos la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos. Sin embargo, cada país ha ratificado distintos tratados y los tratados per se no son vinculatorios hasta que el país no lo incorpora al sistema. Y es ahí donde el punto que quiero más o menos señalar. El profesor Borowski, como dijo en su conferencia, la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos no tiene un carácter vinculante per se, aunque claro, funciona como una forma como una guía o como un fundamento moral de todo el sistema internacional, simplemente padece de esta característica de norma vinculante. Pero entonces, ¿qué sucede cuando el país incorpora un tratado? ¿Qué implicaría esto? Implica que la norma, aun siendo una norma de derecho positivo a nivel internacional, requiere esta incorporación entre el ordenamiento jurídico, por lo cual adquiere las características del ordenamiento jurídico en particular, pero también su función dentro del mismo es determinada por el rango en el cual la norma fue, o el proceso de incorporación, no solamente el proceso de incorporación, también el rango que la norma tiene dentro del sistema. Se le puede dar una norma de rango constitucional, como en el caso mexicano, con el artículo 1, pero también en el caso alemán tiene un rango de norma parlamentaria. Entonces, esto también afecta la ponderación y aplicación de dichas normas, aunque no lo parezca, claro. Uno puede decir, bueno, son derechos fundamentales, es derecho positivo, son normas vinculantes, pero hay que tener en cuenta que al momento de aplicar estos derechos, también hay que considerar las mismas relaciones del sistema jurídico en particular. Entonces, esto también afecta la ponderación. Y ese es el segundo punto en el cual quiero enfocarme. La ponderación parte de la idea de que los derechos fundamentales en Alemania es una posición prima facie, la cual, al momento que se le aplica una restricción, se convierte en un derecho definitivo. ¿Qué es un derecho definitivo? Un derecho definitivo se refiere a cuando, en el supuesto derecho de la norma, que es el ámbito de protección, un acto que una persona promueve, una violación de un derecho, si tal derecho o el acto que él impugna por parte del Estado entra dentro de esa protección, la consecuencia jurídica es la protección constitucional. Y es un efecto de la transformación de derecho positivo de los derechos morales. Es decir, su aplicación y hacer norma vinculante simplemente adquiere este efecto. En Alemania, este examen, antes de aplicar el test de proporcionalidad, primero se revisa, se toma una serie de pasos que el profesor Borowski muy claramente explicó. Uno es primero establecer el ámbito de protección, es decir, aquellos actos que entran en la protección constitucional. Después, revisar si el acto del Estado, ya sea por un acto positivo o negativo, es decir, que el Estado no protegió hasta cierto grado un derecho, representa una lesión. Sin embargo, que haya una lesión o que haya una intervención del Estado no necesariamente siempre implica que sea inconstitucional, porque puede el Estado justificar dicha intervención si lo hace en el cumplimiento o en la promoción de otro bien o derecho constitucional. Y es ahí donde entra el test de proporcionalidad, en el cual señala, claro, la protección prima facie puede ser amplia, pero al momento de aplicar la restricción, limitas esa protección prima facie y lo que queda después de aplicar las restricciones es la protección definitiva. Y la protección definitiva es donde entra el efecto protector de la Constitución. Claro, puede sonar muy técnico, pero esto facilita mucho y aclara los problemas que existen, sobre todo al momento en casos de colisión de derechos fundamentales. En este caso, quisiera hablar más, pero por el tiempo no puedo. Simplemente mis preguntas para el profesor Borowski serán las siguientes. La primera se refiere a los cánones de interpretación. ¿Qué sucede? Muchos críticos de la ponderación señalan que con los cánones de la interpretación es posible resolver todos los conflictos y no es necesario darle al operador jurídico un margen de discrecionalidad tan grande. La segunda pregunta se encuentra también en conexión con lo que preguntó Paula, pero en otro sentido. Como había mencionado, la protección prima facie, al momento de aplicarse las restricciones, determina lo que es el derecho definitivo. Pero ese derecho definitivo también podría considerarse como el núcleo esencial de un derecho. Y entonces mi pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Hay una relación entre este derecho definitivo respecto de lo que señala el artículo 19, párrafo segundo de la Ley Fundamental? Y eso sería todo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, maestro Arnulfo. Con esta última intervención finalizamos la ronda de comentarios y de preguntas. Once we have finished the panelist comments and question section, we will begin the answer sections. You can start with your answers, Professor.
I sincerely thank Paula Gozzoni, Giovanni Figueroa, Francisco Mora, and Arnulfo Mateos for 8 great questions to each. Without exaggeration, I have to say that most of them deserved a full lecture on their own. I have, however, to be brief in my replies. Paula Gozzoni's first question aims at the reconstruction of human dignity. Her question correctly implies that in German constitutional law, we distinguish between applying human dignity, Article 1, Paragraph 1 Basic Law, on its own, and clusters of constitutional provisions containing human dignity. The cluster of Article 2, Paragraph 1 and Article 1 Basic Law is an independent constitutional right developed in the case law of the German Federal Constitutional Court. And the cluster of Article 1 and Article 20 and Paragraph 1, the principle of the social state, a judge-made constitutional right to the subsistence level, a social right. In what follows, I shall consider only human dignity on its own. In the predominant reading, human dignity is an absolute constitutional right. This is to say that an interference can never be justified. Unlike normal constitutional rights, there can be no balancing between the constitutional right and the limiting reasons. Some colleagues welcome this idea as a perfectly adequate show of strength of such rights. The problem is, however, that it is completely unclear what human dignity actually means. This combination of a very vague definition of the expression human dignity and absolute strength of the right is really dangerous. Paula Gozzoni asked whether I can give an example of a judgment in which human dignity was balanced. This must be seen against the backdrop that all relevant German and European courts claim that human dignity or other absolute rights can never be balanced? My answer would be, there are many decisions in which a court claims not to balance in assessing a claim stemming from human dignity, but actually does precisely this, balancing in determining whether there is a definitive subjective right from human dignity. This is usually not done in determining some form of prima facie dignity and then openly balancing this right against another right or a collective good. Rather, some not clearly defined pros and cons are balanced to determine whether human dignity, as a term, applies to the set of facts in question. This might be called definitional balancing. The core of my argument would be, if balancing takes place anyway, it is the better solution to balance the relevant rights and goods openly and clearly, instead of hiding a balancing behind some supposed conceptual considerations. Another issue that deserves some attention is whether it is actually a good idea to conceive of human dignity as a constitutional right itself. The German constitution is less clear on this issue than it might seem, and there has been long-standing opposition in German academic literature. Human dignity could be understood as a reason for constitutional rights, rather than a constitutional right in and of itself. There would be no gap in the protection, since every aspect that is now considered protected by human dignity as a right would be covered by constitutional rights, such as the right to life, physical integrity, personal liberty, the right to respect for private life, and other constitutional rights, actually. There has been a protracted debate on the absoluteness, how to reconstruct this, of human dignity and some other rights commonly regarded to be absolute, and I wrote a rather detailed article on this debate that has just been translated into Spanish and is in the process of being published. Paola Gozzoni's second question asks whether constitutional rights are actually more positive for democracy than my presentation today suggested. She is right that not only constitutional rights limit the results that may be achieved by the democratic process, but that there are also some constitutional rights that safeguard the democratic process. There can be no proper democratic process without the right to vote. And the right to vote is a constitutional right in Germany, Article 38, paragraph 1, clause 1, basic law. What is more, there can hardly be a proper democratic debate without free speech. There is not only an individual's interest in free expression, there is also the collective good of a free exchange of ideas for the sake of democratic debate. Free speech is actually a cluster of both an individual right and a collective good, which explains the extraordinary weight that this right, goods cluster, exhibits in the balancing with its limiting reasons. The same applies to some extent to freedom of assembly, at least insofar as it protects political demonstrations. I would not say that there is a tension in the sense that these two aspects of the relation between constitutional rights and democracy compete with each other in the sense of competing principles. These are just two aspects of a complex relation of constitutional rights and democracy. Giovanni Figueroa asks for parliamentary statutes that ought to realize a constitutional right or good but fail to achieve this to a sufficient degree. Can this, he continues, be corrected by the Constitutional Court by interpreting the statute in conformity with the Constitution, which amounts to, he claims, to taking in fact the place of the democratic parliament? Are there limits to such corrections? To begin with, it may indeed be the case that a parliamentary statute proves to be an under-realization of a constitutional right or good. Let's assume that the Constitution contains the collective good of environmental protection. How can we determine that a certain parliamentary statute fails to realize environmental protection to a sufficient degree? All constitutional rights and goods form a comprehensive constitutional order. Most, if not all, statutes for the protection of the environment limit liberty. Namely, they limit the liberty to perform actions that are harmful for the environment. First and foremost, the liberty to economic activity. This is to say that to establish whether, under the concrete circumstances of a given situation, an adequate extent of environmental protection has been achieved, we need to balance the extent of environmental protection that has been achieved against competing constitutional rights. The result may be that too little environmental protection is achieved, under realization of environmental protection. Too much environmental protection is achieved, over realization of environmental protection, or that the right extent of environmental protection is being achieved, adequate realization of environmental protection. The under-realization of environmental protection represents a violation of this collective good with constitutional status. Its over-realization violates the competing rights or goods, in our case, freedom to pursue economic activity. This is to say that a single constitutional right or a provision recording a collective good is not a legal norm that can be applied on its own and in isolation. Rather, it is a part of a whole constitutional order. Every norm or good must be seen in conjunction with limiting reasons, which also play a role in determining the definitive legal consequence of the constitutional right. The second part of the first question refers to the legal consequence of the judgment that a parliamentary statute under-realizes a constitutional right or good. A statute is a statement phrased in words. These words have become an objective reality and need to be interpreted objectively. The meaning of the words in the statute is often not fully determinate, but permits for a range of possible meanings. As long as a court stays inside the range of possible meanings, it does what courts usually do, interpreting a statute. This is not at all an usurpation of the legislator's role. Interpretation in conformity with the Constitution basically only says that the court ought to prefer those interpretations of a statute that are in conformity with the Constitution and discard those that are not. If there is only one constitutional meaning in the range of possible meanings for which the wording permits, this is the constitutionally necessary meaning. As long as the court stays inside the range of possible meanings of the words in the statute, there is no legislation by the court. If, however, all possible meanings of the words in the statute lead to unconstitutional results, the problem cannot be solved by means of interpretation of the statute. In the case of a negative right, the question arises as to whether a constitutional court is empowered to declare the statute null and void, which is essentially an instance of negative legislation. Repealing a law would usually be legislative activity. The German constitution certainly attributes such power to the constitutional court. The case is more tricky, however, for positive rights or collective goods that call for realization by means of statutes, such as environmental protection. If the constitutional court comes to the conclusion that there ought to be, from the constitutional point of view, a certain extent of environmental protection, but the statute under-realizes this certain extent, and the problem cannot be solved by interpretation in conformity with the Constitution, the parliamentary statute needs to be changed or replaced. This cannot be solved by declaring the statute null and void, for there would be even less realization of environmental protection when the statute is gone. Instead of negative legislation, positive legislation is required. To be sure, the Constitutional Court cannot simply go ahead by enacting legislation itself, since there would be different ways to arrive at a constitutionally adequate extent of environmental protection, so that there is discretion for the legislature. For the reasons of this separation of powers, this discretion deserves respect. The Constitutional Court would, in the first step, declare the current situation unconstitutional and summon the legislator to change the statute to arrive at a constitutionally adequate extent of environmental protection, usually with a deadline. This has usually worked well in Germany, sometimes after repeated demand by the Constitutional Court. The repeated demand is the second step. At the end of the day, it is imaginable that the court declares for an interim period that all administrative agencies and ordinary courts have to act as if a certain statute was in place, which provides for the minimum extent of constitutionally adequate extent of environmental protection. The respect for the legislature is for protecting its discretion. It is not for permanently violating its constitutional obligations. Effective enforcement of constitutional obligations of all branches of government must be possible, and this also extends to the legislature. I hasten to add that such drastic measures should be limited to urgent cases and ought to be only the last resort. I have to be brief with Giovanni Figueroa's second question. The theoretical approach, he asks, is it universal or relativist? My answer is, it is both universal and relativist. It is universal relative to the assumption that there are constitutional rights and goods which compete with each other and require balancing in assessing claims stemming from them. Subjective rights assume that the holders of substantive legal positions have a legitimate interest in enforcing these substantive legal positions before courts. It does not come as a surprise that the German Nazi regime from 1933 to 1945 fundamentally disagreed with the idea of subjective rights of the individual. Not only that such rights were severely limited, such rights were completely denied in the first place. Every system that denies that human beings with their fundamental interests and personal autonomy take center stage in political and constitutional theory would come to different conclusions, be it for ideological or maybe even economical reasons. Francisco Mora raises the question whether I would give priority for a specific theory for the foundation of subjective rights, either the will or the interest of the holder of the right. I think the way he has phrased the question indicates how to answer it. The term foundation is key here. It was a classic controversy at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century in Germany, whether the subjective right is a choice or will of the holder of the right, supported most prominently by Rudolf von Jhering, interest, the choice of will, or an interest of the holder, that supported by Bernhard Winscheid. The difference is that referring to an interest permits paternalistic behavior of the state, while referring to a choice or the will of the holder respects his or her autonomy to a greater degree, but does not ask whether there is a legitimate interest undergirding the autonomous decision. There was an Anglo-Saxon counterpart to this decision, with John Austin supporting the will theory and Jeremy Bentham supporting the interest theory. The key insight provided for by Robert Alexy is that a subjective right is not a will or interest, but, as explained earlier, a procedural legal position referring to the enforcement of a substantive legal position. To be sure, the classic theories remain in the picture, but instead of explaining what subjective rights are, they give reasons for the procedural legal position referring to the enforcement of a substantive legal position. This is what Francisco Mora accurately expresses by asking for the foundation of subjective rights. Now that will and interest have found their place as reasons, there is no need anymore to treat them as standing in opposition. They refer to different aspects of a subjective right. The will theory has a point in taking autonomous decisions of the holder of the right seriously. The interest theory points to the fact that autonomous decisions to enforce supposed substantive legal positions can refer to more or less legitimate interests. There is no need to an either-or decision anymore, and it is plausible that both aspects play an important role. This actually explains why this controversial debate in Germany and England arose in the first place and went on for so long in a lively fashion. Both sides have an important point. I think that against this backdrop, it is possible to understand Hans Kelsen's criticism of the subjective right more comprehensively. Kelsen reacted to the theory of subjective rights of his time, according to which a subjective right is either a will or an interest, actually empirical or metaphysical entities. What is more, there was the historical claim that subjective rights, one imagines powerful princes with a strong will, preceded in the development objective law. For Kelsen, this goes, of course, into two very wrong directions. Reducing law to empirical facts is not sufficiently normative, and resort to metaphysical premises is irrational. What follows now has, of course, to remain a speculation, but I tend to think that Kelsen would be very pleased with the idea that a subjective right is characterized by a procedural legal power that refers to the enforcement of substantive legal positions. The category of legal power, Ermächtigung, is central to the whole pure theory of law, the basic norm, and the whole hierarchical structure of the legal system. Thus, the reconstruction of subjective rights as procedural legal powers referring to the enforcement of substantive legal positions is perfectly in tune with Kelsen's normativity thesis. The only thing he would ask for is that any metaphysical claim with an eye to reasons for accepting the procedural legal power is avoided to make sure that no necessary connection between law and morality comes in through the back door. If one treats will and interest as typical but contingent reasons for subjective rights, to which the lawgiver often resorts, but to which he has not necessarily to resort for reasons of necessary morality, the reconstruction would also be compatible with the positivistic separability thesis. So Kelsen, I think, would be very, very happy. But this is a speculation. I think he would be happy with balancing, but this is also a reconstruction speculation I supported in a couple of years ago. Arnulfo Mateos finally asked which role the traditional canons of interpretation play in the balancing of prima facie positions. Can they provide help in avoiding uncertainties how to balance? In replying to this important question, I shall distinguish between the subsumption stage and the balancing stage of assessing claims stemming from constitutional rights. In my presentation, I mentioned briefly the doctrinal structure of constitutional rights, the area of protection, interference, justification of the interference. Insofar as the area of protection and the interference are concerned, subsumption by means of the traditional canons of interpretation takes place. Consider a case in which freedom of assembly is limited by reference to public health, which has the convenient side effect that government can silence criticism by the opposition. To establish whether there was a violation of freedom of assembly, we need to establish whether the group of people driven apart and away by police using tear gas actually constituted an assembly in the meaning of this term in the Constitution. Were there enough people for the minimum number for an assembly? Was the opinion they wanted to express sufficient for an assembly in the constitutional sense? Does the Constitution limit, the German does, the prima facie position to peaceful assemblies from the outset, so that non-peaceful, violent assemblies are not protected in the first place? If the assembly fell into the area of protection, did state action legally amount to an interference with the right to assembly? This is all subsumption, in which the wording of the Constitution, the intent of the framers of the Constitution, and other traditional canons of interpretation play a key role. Once we arrive at the justification stage, we also have to perform subsumption as to whether there is a competing prima facie claim from public health. Once we have established competing prima facie claims, there is the need to decide which of the competing rights or goods takes precedence at the end of the day. There is, however, no wording of the Constitution or no intent of the framers of the Constitution under which we could subsume to take this decision. The Constitution basically tells us that freedom of assembly and public health are both important, but tells us little, the Constitution, if any, what to do if and when these important rights and goods compete. In terms of legal methodology, this balancing is different in the sense that it needs a different set of arguments for justifying the decision, for wording and intent are simply not there to provide any guidance. To sum up, assessing claims stemming from constitutional rights involves subsumption by means of the traditional canons of interpretation, insofar as the wording of the Constitution and the intent of the framers provide guidance, and balancing beyond this point. The traditional canons are of little use for balancing, for their necessary reference points have run out once we arrive at the balancing stage. A note from Matthäus' second question addresses the essence of the constitutional right according to Article 19, paragraph 2 Basic Law. It is actually unclear and contested how to interpret this provision. Is the essence actually something different from what remains as a definitive right after the limitation of the constitutional right? According to the relative theory of the essence, it provides for the proportionality requirement with the balancing test, which is to say that there can never be a difference. The essence and what remains after proportionate limitation of a right are always perfectly congruent. According to the absolute theory, there is something like an absolute core which resists even proportionate limitations. The key problem is, however, that no one among the supporters of this absolute theory has ever come up with an even half-decent proposal how to determine such absolute core that resists proportionate limitation, let alone a convincing proposal. It is not enough to say that there is an absolute core. We needed criteria for how to determine the extent of this supposed absolute core. In short, either nothing is said on this issue, or the proposal turns out to refer to a hidden balancing, the latter betraying the claim of the true absolute nature of the essence. Let me say by concluding that, as I said at the beginning of these replies, I am aware that my replies needed to be developed further to give a more comprehensive and complete picture. I hope, however, that I have been able to sketch at least outlines of a comprehensive reconstruction of constitutional rights and their interpretation by means of subsumption and balancing. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Vamos ahora a dar paso a algunas preguntas que formularon las personas que están siguiendo la transmisión. Y bueno, por cuestión de tiempo tenemos únicamente 10 minutos para dar contestación. Voy a permitir leer las preguntas. We will begin the section of questions asked by the people who followed the live broadcast. The first question, Professor, is now Professor Borowski's opinion on the link between the judicial precedent in the weighting and in the principle of proportionality is the first question.
Well, thank you. I think this is a great question. I said that the traditional canons of interpretation are of little help because wording and intent have run out. The Constitution in its wording and the intent of the framers does not tell us how to decide balancing judgments. Now, if people before us have stood before the problem and have tried to come up with an answer. This is basically paraphrasing what a precedent is. It is actually part of legal methodology to take precedents seriously. And precedents, if they begin to form a system of precedents, they provide actually for legal certainty, even in balancing. There is a specific issue in German legal methodology. For in traditional German legal methodology, precedents are not considered to be a source of law. This is to some extent reflected, this is not, so to speak, Germany at issue here, but there are some traditions that kind of refuse or are careful in accepting precedents as a source of law. That is reflected in Article 38 of the statute on the for the International Court of Justice, which lists in Article 38 three sources of law, and then after the three sources of law, doctrinal opinions of the most capable scholars, which is basically a legal doctrine, and also precedents, but not as legal sources, but is something supporting the application of legal sources. And I think this is something that German legal methodology should overcome, to accept that at least there is a kind of formal prima facie binding nature of legal precedents. And this is, you could say, a form of soft institutionalization. It's an institutionalization to refer to precedents, because you refer to precedents not because they are substantively correct, but you refer to them because someone else before you took the authoritative balancing decision that a certain outcome is being supported. And for the sake of stability of the legal system, predictability and legal certainty, definitely legal precedents would play a key role in the specific reasons for deciding balancing judgments without the traditional canons. So thank you. I think they are important, and they have to form an important and integral part of legal methodology of balancing.
Okay, thank you very much. The second question is, what is your position in relation to the prevention of correction as a binding figure between law and morals? Is the second question.
Well, thank you. This is a bit, it is not orchestrated, but it is a bit as if it were orchestrated, because the second important aspect for the legal methodology of justifying balancing judgments is resort to some form of morality. Now, lawyers tend to be skeptical if the parties before a court or colleagues begin to talk about morality, because morality, well, how can we agree on morality? But at the end of the day, the very nature of constitutional rights reflects the attempt of the law to mediate between ideal normativity and facticity. So there is a claim in law, and this claim is the claim to moral correctness. We claim that we arrive at a just decision, and one can be skeptic and say, well, these are empty words, but one can also choose to take this seriously. And the problem now is, how can you arrive at some kind of objective morality? And it is certainly, so to speak, a part of the problem surrounding the debate on balancing, is that Robert Alexy, in developing principle theory, has done a marvelous job in explaining the structure of balancing. It's a marvelous job. I think it's really progress. He always has been relatively hesitant and to some extent silent on the set of arguments that justify balancing judgments from a normative point of view. But also in his system, he supports the law's claim to correctness. I think he also would agree that there may well be substantive reasons for balancing judgments. And if you support some weak form of natural law, this is not a problem at all. However, legal positivists, of course, would immediately disagree and say, no, well, this is the kind of old attempt of natural lawyers to refer to some kind of ideal order. Yeah, there is a problem of uncertainty, certainly, and maybe that Kelsen with his relativism goes too far, that there are some core contents that can be objectively justified, but of course this definitely needs to be limited. My idea that I have published recently in this or that paper on touching on these issues is that actually we could have, before we resort directly to pure morality, to what a judge as a moral reasoner regards as correct from the moral point of view, that we place a layer between the law as, so to speak, hard institutionalized norms and pure normativity, pure ideal normativity, morality, that we place a layer in between. And that layer would be positive morality. Now, it is actually a virtue of constitutional court judges is not only that they are knowledgeable as lawyers, they are also moral persons that know very well the positive morality, the moral views in society. And before we resort to some kind of strange or outlandish moral ideas of individual judges, it is their obligation, because their judgment is taken in the name of the people. It's not their judgment as autonomous individual persons. It is actually a judgment in the name of the people. So the empirical moral beliefs would be something that has to play a role. Now, for positivists, this would be the final answer because they have nothing above empirical moral beliefs. This is a social question at the end of the day. But at least positivists, I think, would be happy with positive morality as a tool in informing balancing judgments. And if one is willing, and I would argue on behalf of that, if one is willing to accept that there is at least some thin objective morality that is necessarily connected with the law, of course, then you can arrive at a competition between positive morality and correct morality. If, just to give you a textbook case, if there is the positive morality, but you are unfortunately currently living in a slaveholder society, then in cases of gross immorality, like supporting slavery by means of positive morality, there would be a tension between positive morality and correct morality, and there could be a kind of prima facie preference for positive morality, which can, however, in cases of drastic immorality, be overruled by correct morality. But I think at the end of the day, we cannot really avoid the question. You can avoid morality. You can say that there is a certain image of man, on the image of man, and the relation between man and society that is undergirding a constitution and that is prevalent in society, which is basically the same as saying that there is some kind of morality, but it sounds less offensive. But I think at the end of the day, we need to refer in some form and to some extent also to substantive criteria. Positive morality would again be formal, but if there is correct morality behind it, it would be a formal substantive combination. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We are truly very grateful for your conference. It will be a privilege to visit New Mexico and to be able to learn from you. Thank you, Professor. Así damos fin al evento de esta mañana. Y me gustaría, en primer lugar, agradecerle al maestro Arnulfo Mateos por la organización, por la traducción de la ponencia, por la traducción de las respuestas y, por supuesto, también agradecer en primer lugar a la doctora Paula por estas excelentes preguntas que giraron en torno a la dignidad humana, por agradecerle también el tiempo. Sabemos que es una persona con muchas actividades académicas. Mi agradecimiento también al doctor Francisco Mora. Es un gran filósofo del derecho mexicano y creo que es una de las grandes promesas académicas que actualmente tenemos el gusto de aprender de él. Mi agradecimiento a mi amigo y coordinador también del grupo, Giovanni Figueroa, por esta apreciación desde el punto de vista comparatista, el relativismo, y bueno, sabemos que Giovanni siempre tiene una clara idea sobre lo que significa comparar y sobre todo lo que significa hacer ciencia. Y bueno, finalmente, de nueva cuenta, mi agradecimiento a Arnulfo Mateos. Muchas gracias por todo, Arnulfo. En verdad, ojalá que pronto nos volvamos a ver aquí en México. Te extrañamos mucho, pero sabemos que estás haciendo un gran papel en Heidelberg y ojalá que cuando regreses podamos organizar más de este tipo de eventos. Y bueno, finalmente agradecerles a todas y ustedes por su tiempo. Tuvimos una excelente respuesta en redes sociales y bueno, que estén muy bien, que tengan una excelente tarde en Heidelberg y que tengan también una excelente tarde en México. Muchas gracias. Voy a finalizar la transmisión en vivo.